Today I'm going to tell you all about release time, because even though it might be easier to set, if you get it wrong, it can really mess up your compressor, really mess up the audio source. So there is a really clear way to do it. I've got 2 tips for you and 2 key approaches. And generally you're going to use one of these 2 approaches every time you apply compression. This makes it really simple, but if you don't have an awareness of these, you might be doing it completely wrong and you could be ruining your audio. So that's all to come. So my first tip when it comes to release times is if your compressor does have an auto release button, use it. Try it. A lot of people shy away. They think of it like a template almost, but auto release is great. It's going to probably be the most musical. It's going to actually take into account a lot more things than you can ever do by setting the release time to a specific time. So if it has an auto release button, give it a go. It's probably going to be the best option. It means you're going to quickly set the release time. You're not going to have to worry about it. You can move on to something that's more important. Of course, a lot of compressors, especially now plugins, don't have an auto release, so that's not always possible, but if you do have it, give it a go. Sometimes it will sound better, and it will also save you quite a lot of time and effort, so you can move on to something else in the mix. Tip number 2 is to always opt for a slower release time and err on that side of the spectrum. Be careful, because fast release times can lead to distortion, can really mess with the way that the compressor works and sound really unnatural and not very musical, not very subtle. So always edge more towards a slower release time, and I'm going to talk more about that in a second. Now, my first approach to actually tweaking your attack time and setting it is to just make the compressor breathe in time with the music. And this is something that you've probably heard before maybe, and a lot of people will just tell you to adjust it so it breathes in time with the music without going into much more detail. So what that generally means is adjusting the compressor so that it goes back to 0 between the beats, or at least once a bar. And to do this, obviously it will depend on the tempo of the music. If it's a really fast track, you're going to have to use a faster release time to make sure that the compressor actually resets to 0 between the phrases, if it's a vocal, between the notes. If it's a really slow song, you can use a slower release time. That's going to sound even more musical. It's going to be less noticeable, because generally if it's a slower song, you would be able to hear the compression a lot more, especially if it was a fast release time. So you can start in the general area by knowing if it's a slower song, you're going to be using a slower release. If it's a faster up-tempo song, it'll be a faster release. But there is a way to actually do it. So here I've got a vocal. This is the same one that I was working with in the last video on attack time. So we've set the attack time, and we've set the ratio and the threshold. So now we just need to adjust this release time. And I don't have an auto release function on this, so I'm going to have to set this manually. So I'm going to start with a really slow release time just to show you what this looks like. And you'll notice release times are generally a lot slower than attack times. So 1.4 seconds we've got here. So that's taken a second and a half almost to reset back to 0 once the audio goes back above the threshold.
Nah, but I guess that we ran out.
So if you watch this gain meter, you'll notice it never goes back to 0. And this is a good example of when the release time is too slow, which is a thing. You have to err towards the slower side. But if it's too slow, the compressor's not really working because it's never releasing the audio. So instead of clamping down on the louder notes and letting the quieter notes pass through, which is essentially what you're trying to do, instead it's just clamping down on everything. So everything just becomes the same volume again. So watch this. With a 1.4 second release, you'll see it never goes back to 0.
Nah, but I guess
So it's just hovering around there, which is what we don't want. So all we have to do is just bring this up until we start to see this kind of pumping in time with the music. Now I don't have any music here, it's just a vocal on its own, but you can still hear the tempo of the song. So I'm just going to adjust it so that it's going back to 0 every few beats or every few words, and it kind of looks like it's breathing in tempo.
Nah, but I guess that we ran out of luck. My head is played, my heart is stopped by stupid little things. Well, they're all that I can say. Like, did you see me stare?
So there we go. Even with a 528.7 millisecond release, which is half a second, it's still breathing in time with the tempo. It's quite a slow song. I think it's around that 120 BPM standard kind of rock tempo, and It's resetting back to 0, which is what we want to see, so the compressor is actually doing its job, and it's also doing it slowly. It's not just really quickly resetting, it's kind of breathing in time with the music. So it's kind of an abstract concept, but that's the way to go about it. Start with a slow release time, bring it up until you start to see it pump in, and just make sure it's resetting back to 0 in most cases. Now, the second approach you can have is to just set the release as fast as it will go. So literally as fast as it will go depending on your compressor. So for this, it's all the way to the left. For a analog modeling, it'd be all the way to the right. So what it's going to do, it's going to clamp down on the loudest peaks, and then it's really going to quickly release. So that means the loudest peaks get squashed, but immediately afterwards, the rest of the stuff comes through uncompressed. So we're raising the apparent volume more so. It's going to sound less musical, it's going to sound a lot less subtle, and in some cases it can actually lead to distortion. So you need to be careful, but this is another approach. Let's have a listen to how this sounds.
Nah, but I guess that we ran out of luck. My head is played.
So already we can see it's a bit too fast, so we're going to have to tweak it a bit. Let's try 10 milliseconds.
Nah, but I guess that we ran out.
Let's try going a bit higher, so you just keep going higher until you can actually see that there is some effective compression happening.
Nah, but I guess that we ran out of luck. My head is played.
So it sounds different. You're doing a different thing with a compressor. You're only catching the peaks and then releasing them really quickly, as opposed to before when I was at 500, it sounded a bit more like this.
Nah, but I guess that we ran out of luck. My head is played.
So quite a big difference in tone. Let's go back to quick.
Nah, but I guess that we ran out of luck. My head is played.
And you can hear a jump in volume because, of course, now the compressor isn't clamping down as much. So that is another approach. Be a bit more careful with that. It works well on vocals, especially pop vocals where you want them to be really loud, but make sure you're not adding any distortion. Make sure you are actually compressing the peaks, because if the release time's too quick, it's not really going to do anything, because by the time the attack time's kicked in, the release time is just going to be like the compressor's never really engaging. So start fast, move it back a bit. That's approach number 2, but generally I recommend sticking to approach number 1. This doesn't just apply to vocals, with anything, just tweaking the release time until it's kind of breathing in time with the music. Make sure it's slowly latching off, that's going to sound more musical, but still resetting to 0 between the beats and between the phrases or notes. But if you've got an auto release feature, turn that on, it will save you a lot of time. So that's it for release time. Hope you found that helpful, and I'll see you soon.